Good afternoon. My name is Deacon Steve Kramer. I am a professor here at Sacred Heart Seminary School of Theology, and this particular talk is a continuation of the library spirituality series. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about the spirituality of the diaconate. Now, in terms of seminary formation, there are men who will be ordained as transitional deacons, men who will be deacons for approximately 6 months to a year, depending upon their diocese. And then there are men like myself who are ordained as permanent deacons. A little bit different between the two. One is moving definitely towards the priesthood, one who lives a life of service, and for the permanent deacon, one who shares in two different sacraments. The permanent deacon, not necessarily, but probably 95% of us are married men, so we share in the sacrament of matrimony, and we share in the sacrament of holy orders. So I'd like to really explore a little bit about what the deacon does in today's world. There are three, what we call munera, or three tasks of the deacon. The deacon is the minister of the word, he's the minister of the altar, and the minister of charity. And each one has a very specific part in the life of the deacon. So for the ministry of the Word of God, that's something that most people will see the deacon at. The deacon will be proclaiming the gospel every time that the deacon is present at Mass. If there are 3 priests, 2 bishops, a cardinal, doesn't matter, it is the deacon's responsibility to proclaim the gospel that day. He is specifically wedded to the gospel, and at our ordination we place our hands on the gospel, the book of the Gospels, and the bishop will say a specific prayer over us at that point in time. A deacon can also preach, and not necessarily that he preaches every single week, but the way that the general instruction of the Roman Missal says that the homily is normally given by the presider at that particular Mass. However, the homily can be entrusted to the deacon or a visiting priest or deacon, depending upon what the case might be. When the diaconate came back into full force after Vatican II, one of the roles of the deacon specifically was preaching. And that was that as somebody who potentially could be married, and as it turned out, many are, and working in the workforce, there would be a different voice that would be heard at Mass. And I think that's important to recognize, is that from a spiritual standpoint, it's not a question that the priest or the bishop or the deacon is better or worse for any of them. It's that each voice is different. And because the deacon has a different voice, primarily living in the world, it's going to perhaps touch on some areas that the priest or the bishop might not be totally familiar with because they don't live in the world in that respect. In other words, they're not having a regular job, perhaps raising children, family. So, in addition to proclaiming the gospel, preaching, in the ministry of the word, the deacon's called to do some catechetical instruction and also to give retreats. A lot of deacons will be involved in retreat ministry for teenagers, for young children, for adults, sometimes for divorced and separated groups. So there's a lot of work that's done in terms of preaching and being with people as a minister of God's word. Deacons who have a secular occupation are able to witness to the gospel in the marketplace, but they meet the demands of both their work, whatever that work environment might be, and also bringing the Word of God in different situations. So it's a different type of life. Spirituality changes because you're also balancing a number of different plates in the air, like I said. There's always 3 plates that are spinning. The deacon is spinning the plate of his family, his secular work, and his church ministry. And somehow, God's presence and that spirituality is intertwined between all 3 of them. Where most people will see the deacon will be at the altar. And since the liturgy is the summit and source of all of our activities in church, we recognize that that's where all of our powers flow from. So in the liturgy, the deacon brings the gifts of the people and articulates their needs. At the Eucharist, the deacon assists the community in worship and helps to minister in word and sacrament. Now, in the early church, the deacon was very specifically tied towards the bishop, and his role really was to bring the needs of the community to the bishop. The deacon was the one that administered charity. He was the one that took care of the money, took care of the responsibilities of the church itself, He was the one who brought to the bishop and said, these folks need our help. This community needs our help. And that's why a lot of times when you're at Mass, you'll notice that the deacon is the one who will read the prayers of petition, prayers of the faithful. Because again, he is supposed to understand, because of his life lived outside of the church, what people need, what they desire, what they need, and to bring those needs to the church for the day. The deacon also performs other liturgical roles, solemnly baptizing, witnessing marriages, bringing viaticum to the dying, very specifically. The deacon presides over funerals and burials. He presides over liturgies of the Word, liturgies of the hours, exposition, benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. He leads non-sacramental reconciliation services, and of course conducts prayer services for the sick and the dying. In terms of preaching, the deacon always preaches at anything that he presides at. So if he is the minister of baptism, of the wedding that day, or of a funeral, it is he who preaches. Now, let's move to the ministry of charity and love. From the beginning, even in the first century, the diaconate had always been a ministry of love and charity. The early church found the deacon with widows, with children, with orphans, always with the sick, and often enough at the graves of the dead, or being with those who were dying. The deacon was one who was with foreigners and somebody who had been in exile, always willing to welcome and bring people back into the church and the love of the church and the love of Jesus Christ. It might be said today that the deacon is the interpreter of the needs and the desires of all kinds of different Christian communities and the promoter of the church's service. And that's what the diaconia means. Diaconia comes from the Greek, which means one who serves. And it's interesting because as an icon of Christ the servant, that's where the deacon really comes into play. The deacon's spirituality is in serving others as Christ served others too. Remember, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. So in our world today, deacons serve a multitude of people. You'll find a deacon today working with people in prison, working with abused children, battered women, people who have been abused by human trafficking or slavery. A lot of deacons have ministry with those who are divorced. And some of the difficulties that come from living in a divorced family, working with children of those who have been divorced, people working through the annulment process. Deacons are definitely there for those who are suffering from drug and alcohol abuse. In whatever way, shape, form possible, they're to help get people into treatment, to recommend counselors, to be able to be there for spouses or parents or children, as the case might be, to help them work through that difficult time. Deacons are there for refugees. They're there for the rural poor. I myself spent a number of years working way up in Maine in the northeast part of the country with a lot of folks who were rural poor. These are people who were way back in the woods. There were people who still in today's world were trapping beavers and foxes and things. A whole different world than perhaps modern day urban or even suburban living. You will find the deacons of today working with those who are homeless, people who are victims of racial or ethnic discrimination. Deacons would be there, again, with our priests and bishops, any of these things, but primarily to help people who are dealing with fair housing, let's say, victims of housing discrimination. Without a doubt, I can say from my own personal ministry, deacons are there for the bereaved, for those who are being with those who are dying as we speak, for those who have just died, to be there to help guide them through the funeral mass, perhaps to be with them at the cemetery. For those who are ill, that is the role of the deacon, is the pastoral care of the sick, to be there to help, to bring Christ's presence at a time when it seems nobody else is around. So deacons are meeting all of these people in the name of the church, and among them, they are representing the care of Christ's servant. So that in a lot of ways, the diaconate serves people. And it's from community to community, from town to town. It's going to be different depending upon where the deacon serves. I myself have worked in New York for many, many years. I've worked in rural Maine. I've been here in Milwaukee for almost 7 years now. Each area of the country is different, and yet people are the same. It depends on what their needs are at any given moment in time. But the deacon assists the powerless. He gives voice to the voiceless. The deacon promotes the common service of the church, and he inspires to promote service by making sure that it's not just him who does the work, but he is the one who propels others to serve in the name of Christ. The deacon has a special responsibility to identify to the church those people who are in need, people who live on the fringe, the margins of society. In biblical times we call them the Anawim, those who are the lost, those that people don't see. In today's world, we might look at those folks as those who are refugees, undocumented workers, people who are elderly, but people seem to fade away from the public consciousness, but definitely have specific needs. The deacon is to speak about those who are needy, to articulate those needs, and he becomes a representative figure to whom the church reaches out to, and also to challenge the church to do what's right. Most deacons have secular occupations, and in those secular occupations, there's a lot of opportunities to carry out this ministry of charity and love and justice in their everyday work. For myself, I've been doing full-time church work, let's call it, for over 10 years now. But I did spend 30 years of my life in the construction business. And I can tell you from a spiritual point of view, so many times that I've met people on different construction sites. Some folks knew I was a deacon, some did not, but it would not be unusual for some 6'5" burly guy to come over to me and say, "Hey, Richie said that you're some guy that works in a church. Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure, what's going on?" And then this 300-pound behemoth man would just break down crying because his dad died 2 days before. "Can I help him?" "Sure." We sit, we chat, and often enough I would be at the funeral home 2 or 3 days later doing a wake service or a burial service for his dad. It's in those moments we recognize our common humanity, and we understand that although our liturgical sense is important because that's where people see us often enough, but it's through our preaching, through our administration of the sacraments, that people say, "This is somebody I want to talk to." And once that conversation begins, that's where the spirituality flows. The spirituality flows because people recognize that the deacon is a man of God who not only believes what he says, but he walks the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk. In order to do that, one must have a good spiritual life, a sense of prayer, a sense of understanding about the importance of living and working for the church. Perhaps if the deacon is a married man, to understand the value of living in the sacrament of matrimony, the care and love for their children. For me, it has been a wonderful ministry. This May I've celebrated 27 years of ordination. But I also have celebrated the sacrament of matrimony with my wife for 42 years. And both of them are at play at the deacon. It's a ministry of love and charity and the altar. All three are important, but all of them are inseparable. Every one of these parts of the deacon is who they are. One cannot be separated from the other. It's not that you take off this hat and go, "Okay, now I'm going to be a police officer, now I'm going to be a school teacher, now I'm a pharmacist." You're always a deacon, and you're always whatever that is, whatever your occupation is. The two come together, and in those two, you recognize that the church and the people of God are served by one who serves, the person of Diaconate.